Not long after I released another Sadler's Stories video, one of the viewers asked an interesting question. Talk about how you quit smoking. And I gave kind of a facetious answer at first. I said, oh, it's like super easy to quit smoking. I've done it dozens of times. And that is quite true. Quitting is easy. Staying quit is a much more difficult task, in part because nicotine is so addictive and you have all these other associations, let's call them, positive and negative, with smoking cigarettes or in my case also cigars. And I thought it deserved a better answer, a fuller answer. And so I'm going to tell the story. Let's call it, originally I was thinking tobacco use, because I also, in addition to smoking cigars and cigarettes, I did try chew at one time, didn't really like it. I also tried snuff a couple times, and that didn't stick. But we'll just stick with cigarettes and cigars. So, I grew up in, let's call it, a time and culture and place where smoking was just ubiquitous. My mother smoked for a long time. My dad smoked. My grandfather on my dad's side smoked. My grandfather on my mom's side smoked. My uncles smoked. The ones who didn't used chew, various forms, snuff, things like that. And, the neighbors smoked. It was very, very common to go into people's houses and there would be ashtrays and, people would sit around and smoke while they did things. And so, we're talking about, in my case, the 1970s and 1980s. Just say it was very prevalent. You could go into a bowling alley and there would be people smoking as they're bowling and drinking beer. Restaurants typically would have a smoking section and a non-smoking section, but the cigarette smoke would eventually go over there. You could go to McDonald's and they actually had these tiny little foil ashtrays that people would steal. Burger King had them as well. And I imagine probably every fast food joint had them. And, ashtrays were kind of a common gift to people. We made ashtrays in our ceramics sections of our art class for our parents who smoked back in elementary school and in middle school. So, it was just everywhere. And, it was kind of tough as a non-smoker. I remember we would eat dinner and my mom and my dad and grandpa would all be smoking at the dinner table while me and my sister are, sitting there and our eyes are kind of watering, and we'd ask them not to smoke and they'd put their cigarettes out, and then, a little while would go by and they'd light up again. And people would smoke in the car, smoke out. There were ashtrays in the car, cigarette lighters in the car. You could smoke on airplanes. So it was a very common thing. And I didn't actually start smoking, despite the fact that many of my friends and classmates did smoke, until I was 17. I did actually try chewing tobacco twice. Once my uncle gave me some to try, and I wasn't very experienced with it, and it kind of migrates in your mouth. Another was on a camping trip with a bunch of people from my high school. So they weren't allowed to smoke, but they were allowed to do chew, which is a little bit kind of a strange contradiction there. And I didn't like that. It wasn't my thing. And I remember, like, for example, riding in the truck with my Uncle Aim, or being in the basement of Grandpa and Grandma's house. Uncle Aim had a whole wood shop down there, and he'd be smoking while he was working on stuff or driving. And the smell was kind of good, depending on what the cigarettes were, right? And I didn't want to smoke myself, but I kind of liked that tobacco smell. And then when I was a janitor, working in restaurants, you'd clean up people's messes that involved cigarettes, and then it didn't smell quite so good. But anyway, I was working in a restaurant. I was working at a Ponderosa, and I got that job right after I finished high school, before I went in the Army. And I was there for a number of months. And, you have your coworkers, and you start to have some camaraderie with them. And I just, some of my friends already smoked, and I started bumming a cigarette here and there and taking a couple puffs, and I enjoyed it. That sort of constriction of your lungs and the nicotine hitting you. And then I guess you could say I was hooked, right? And I started partaking in the kind of rituals that people do when they smoke. And, some of these are like pairing it with certain drinks, like you wake up in the morning and you have a cup of coffee and you have a cigarette with it, right? Or you're, drinking, you're having some beers, and, you're smoking while you're drinking beer with people. Well, that was kind of nice. And, that continued through, and eventually I started buying my own packs instead of bumming them from people. And I will say this too, cigarette smoking was way, way, way cheaper back then. There were some taxes on it, but not to the extent that there currently are, because they've, disincentivized it. And now, people at that time knew that smoking did raise your chances for getting cancer. Some people were in denial about it, but it said it right there on the pack, And this is the time when some of the lawsuits were beginning in the late 80s and all of that sort of business. But, I was enjoying myself, and I found that it didn't really interfere with my lifestyle. I was in incredibly great shape at that time, so smoking didn't have any, really negative side effects on me at that point. And then I went in the Army, and going in the Army, so we couldn't smoke when we were in basic training, right? Except when, of course, we got to go on leave. I was a combat engineer, so basic and AIT were combined into one big 13-week thing, but we got to go on, a 3-day leave in between the two parts, and, we got cigarettes and beer and liquor and had a good time, right? And then I got out, and I was, ready to go to my duty station. I went on leave for a bit, and of course, started smoking again. And then I went to Germany, and when I was in Germany and I was staying, on post, if you went to the PX, you could buy cigarettes incredibly cheap because there was no state tax, right? So a carton, that's 10 packs of cigarettes, 10 packs of 20 cigarettes would cost me $7. Now, there was a restriction. You had a ration card. You were only allowed to buy 4 cartons a month, and then you had like 20 individual packs that you could buy. But you could always get somebody who didn't smoke and use their ration card. And so I would do things like, buy a carton, and we would generally store them in the refrigerator. I'm not exactly sure why. I think we thought it would keep it fresher, and there was something about let's get a cool cigarette out and light it up, and it'll make the smoke nicer or something. We had all sorts of crazy superstitions about that sort of stuff. And in the Army, the people who smoke a lot because you got a couple minutes to kill. Well, go have a cigarette, right? And enjoy yourself. And when you're out in the field doing exercises, everyone would have, even the people who didn't smoke would smoke. And so, it was a way of building camaraderie. It was a way of getting by. And we would do crazy, crazy stuff. We would be on our 5-mile run in the morning, and somebody would bring a pack of cigarettes with a lighter in it. And, we young people who smoked, we would be running, and it was almost like a relay race, right? So somebody would get out the pack, and they'd light it up, and they'd take a puff, and then they'd hand it to the next guy in front of him in formation, and he'd take it, and he'd take a puff, and then he'd hand it to the next guy until the cigarette was gone. And the older guys were all like, "Oh, you're going to regret that when you get older." And we're all like, "Oh, you old men, we don't care about that. We feel fine. It's not affecting us," right? And so, you did all that sort of stuff. And then if you went out to the bars and partied, or you're sitting around in the barracks, you'd smoke as well. And so that really reinforced the habit for me. And then when I got out, and I went to college, actually I worked in a restaurant for a while before I went to college, I continued that. And again, buying cigarettes was easy, cheap. You buy yourself a carton. Now it would be a little bit more expensive than in the Army, but it was still, pretty affordable. And you had cigarette machines in bars and pool halls and bowling alleys and hotels, and you just put your money in and get your pack of cigarettes out. And I kind of experimented with smoking different things. I smoked Marlboros, I smoked Camels. For a little while I smoked unfiltered Lucky Stripes. While I was in the Army, I tried out menthols, and I'd smoke Cools for a while, or Newport, or things like that. And each cigarette's got its own kind of flavor. I also smoked Winston's, which is what my dad and grandpa had on my mom's side had smoked. And I didn't actually care for them that much. I stuck with the other things as well. And, so this just kind of continued, and a lot of my friends smoked. And then I remember, this is very interesting, when I was in college, it was, I want to say my junior year, the state of Wisconsin passed a law. You couldn't smoke in any public buildings anymore. You could still smoke in bars or restaurants or places like that, but you couldn't smoke, like, as we were doing, in classrooms, for example, where the lecture, the discussion would end, the class would be over, and we'd all get our cigarettes out and light up and chat with the professor who's also smoking. So that was the end of that. And we had to go outside like a bunch of heathens, in the cold, and we grumbled about it. But then after a while, all that haze cleared out, and we were like, oh, that must have been really bad for the non-smokers, So anyway, the crowd that I ran with, we smoked and drank and partied and stuff like that. I never got into pot because, well, two reasons. One was, the few times that I tried it, I didn't find it that enjoyable, and I didn't like the taste. And I also didn't like the kind of dummies who were smoking pot all the time. It seemed to make people kind of boring rather than interesting. Drinking was my intoxicant of choice at the time, and smoking went along with drinking. And, this continued on. I finished college. I came down here to Milwaukee, lived here for a year working, and, smoking as well, a way to kill time, a way to enjoy myself. And then I went to graduate school. And in between, I went to Quebec. I saved up some money, from my job, went to Quebec, and then went to Europe. And I was traveling around Europe for about a month and a half or so before I came back, and then went to graduate school. And there, I started buying French Gauloise cigarettes, which I really enjoyed as well. That was kind of fun. And then, I'm in graduate school, and, still working out a lot. I mean, I would actually do things like I would have a cigarette in my mouth, and I would be jumping rope as I'm puffing away, Or when we were jamming, I was playing bass in bands and stuff like that in college. You'd be playing, and you'd have a cigarette like hanging out of your mouth, or you'd be writing a paper, and you'd be smoking away. I should also mention too, when I tutored the Chinese students, they were all heavy smokers as well, and they would sometimes pay me by making me meals, and sometimes they would just give me packs of cigarettes, right, while I was preparing their lesson plans or things like that. So by the time that I get to grad school, I'm smoking quite a bit. And I never if I was partying, I might smoke 2 packs in a day and a night, right? Or I was working on a paper. But I was generally about a pack a day kind of smoker. And then while I was in grad school, things changed. I started, instead of smoking cigarettes that you would buy in a pack, I started getting into rolling my own. And, I usually buy drum, and I would buy these big cans that cost about $15, and you get not thousands of cigarettes out of them, but hundreds of cigarettes out of them. And it was unfiltered, and it was higher quality tobacco. It was nice and moist, and so it had a really great mouth feel, and, that nicotine would hit you pretty hard too, right? And, I don't think at that time I actually did try to quit smoking in any serious way, because I just enjoyed it, and it wasn't really. I mean, you'd have like that cough in the morning, and stuff like that, but it wasn't having a huge effect on me, and I was getting more pleasure than pain out of it, you could say. And I enjoyed, the things that went with it. Having, like I said, that cup of coffee or a latte and, rolling your own cigarette and having that together, those two tastes combining, or having a nice meal and then going outside with the other smokers to have a smoke together. That was kind of nice, right? And by this time, my mom had quit smoking. My dad was long gone. My grandpa was gone. Grandpa Lemrise had also quit smoking by that time. So it was like a younger people sort of thing. And, eventually I got out of smoking cigarettes, and I started smoking instead cigars. And the way that ended up happening was my friend Gary, we used to hang out a lot together. He was also a grad student in philosophy, and we were into some of the same stuff, and we'd chat a lot and hang out. And so anyway, there was a tobacco store in town in Carbondale, and one day we're sitting out in a beer garden. It's like afternoon, and we're drinking pitchers of beer. And he's like, well, let's go get some cigars. Wouldn't that be kind of cool, kind of nice? And I was like, yeah, okay, let's go and do that. And so we go to the store, and they knew him there because he was buying cigars. And so I start smoking cigars, and I'm enjoying that way, way more than I'm enjoying the cigarettes. And so I stopped smoking the cigarettes, and I'd go and get myself cigars, and you can get yourself like tins that have 10 cigars in them, and you can buy yourself big cigars and stuff like that. And so that continued on through grad school, and I really enjoyed that quite a bit. Cigars, there's so much more complexity to the taste. You don't generally inhale it all the way into your lungs, but you still get that buzz. It's unfiltered. It's a little bit more expensive, although, cigarette smoking has become very expensive these days as well. And that continued on through graduate school. I graduated. We moved to my family's land in Indiana. And then my Uncle Scott and I were kind of like bad influences on each other. He lived right across the way, and we each got a humidor, and we got into this cigar club where we'd order you get like 25 cigars in a batch, and he'd be like, hey, try some of these. And I'd be like, yeah, let's try some of these that I got too. And we'd like compare notes and stuff like that. And I was smoking probably 1 to 2 big Churchill cigars every day. Because I enjoyed it so much, Back then I was also brewing my own beer, and, those went really well together, and there was a lot of sitting outside and, playing music or doing things while smoking, reading books, hanging out with my uncles and chatting about stuff. And so that continued on for quite a long time. And when I moved down to Fayetteville, I didn't take the big humidor with me. And I would occasionally have a cigar here and there, and I sometimes buy these 10-pack of the smaller ones, Macanudos or other brands that you would get. And sometimes there'd be sales, so you buy up a bunch of these. And that continued on for a long time. And then when I got involved with my wife, we were both smoking together, which probably wasn't great for our pets, but that it was something that we were doing, and eventually she quit, and eventually I quit. But it takes quite a while when you are used to smoking to really make that quit stick. And I think I haven't had a cigar now for quite some time. It got to the point where I would only have one on my birthday, and I don't think I had one my last birthday. I still really do enjoy the smell of a good cigar, or even sometimes tobacco smoke from a cigarette. I'm glad I quit. I'm glad that I'm not doing that, because, as you get older, it's really not good for your body in many, many different ways, not just for your lungs, but also your circulatory system, and it's, you know, it ages your face quite a bit. But I will say this, it's not a struggle to stay quit, but I can see why people go back. And I really enjoyed smoking. It was such a social thing to do. It was such a nice pleasure. It's very expensive now, I would say, even if you're purchasing things at discount places. And maybe that's a good thing. It's probably a good thing that less younger people are smoking tobacco these days, but there's also some things that I really did enjoy about it. And, you know, do I have regrets? I could say that I regret spending all of that time smoking, but I actually don't. And I actually, the effects on health, you know, they're not that major for me. I would say it's more about the money that I spent that I could have spent on other things instead. I certainly used smoking as a kind of catalyst and sustainer for my writing activities. You know, I would sit and have you know, cigarettes, or sometimes I'd even just like chew on a cigar, you know, and work with that. And that was kind of a crutch, right? But on the whole, you know, do I regret the years that I spent smoking, the decades? Not really. Would I start it up again? No, probably not. I mean, I might enjoy a cigar once in a very great while now, but I wouldn't take it up again. So anyway, that's a long story. Hopefully this has satisfied some people's curiosity about my references to cigarettes and smoking that come up every once in a while in other stories. I also use them as references sometimes when I'm talking about pleasures or even addictions and prudence and things like that in my other philosophical videos. And, you know, I'm sure some of you out there watching this are smokers. I'm not going to condemn you or anything for it. I'll just say it's probably not good for you. And there's other things that you can do that you might get the same thrill or kick or enjoyment out of, or at least a different one that's commensurate and not quite as hard on your body and not as expensive. But, you know, all things being equal, it's not the worst thing you could do in the world. So I'm going to end it here. Otherwise, I might go on and on and on and say that's pretty much the end of this story.